Oh no, not the recording.
So, Unit 11, which I can't believe we're here already, closing the transaction. Look at that. We have made it like, I see Jordana is freaking out already. We have made it full circle. We have
Facts.
the book is laid out in a transactional order. And so once you get to closing, you're pretty much there. Now, there's a couple of things after this that we talk about. We're going to talk about investment and taxation because that comes after you already own the property. And then we got to do a unit about property management because that's completely separate than, sales. But this is like the culmination of the sales process. We have gone all the way through the entirety of the transaction from the standpoint of a sale, and now we're here at the finish line. And what do we need to know about that finish line? What is going to be the rules that we have to follow, and the math that gets involved with handling these closing statements or the closings themselves. So the first thing we want to talk about is what we need to do in order to be prepared for closing, to prepare our clients for closing. And obviously that's going to change somewhat depending on what side of the transaction we are on. Are we on the buyer side of the transaction? Are we on the seller side of the transaction? But no matter which side we're on, we need to make sure that the closing attorney or closing agent, whoever is handling the closing, mostly a closing attorney for us here in North Carolina, the closing attorney or title company, if you were in a state, and the reason I point out the stuff that's in other states is it might show up that way on a national test. On a national test, if they refer to a title company, folks, they mean the closing agent. That's other states don't use attorneys for closings always. They mostly use title companies, but they accomplish largely the same function as our closing attorneys do here. Make sure they have a copy of the sales contract. If the job of the closing attorney is to close the transaction, they need to see exactly what has been promised by that buyer and that seller in that contract. So they need to get a copy of this contract early on in the process so that they know how to proceed with closing it, because closing is the fulfillment of all of those things.
Whose choice is the attorney?
That's a really great question. Who chooses the attorney? It should be the buyer's choice in the vast majority of transactions. And notice I said the buyer and not the buyer's agent. I think one of the things that gets lost in the shuffle sometimes is while we might make recommendations about who our clients should use for attorneys, for lenders, for insurance companies, ultimately, who is always making the choice of those things?
Buyer.
The client.
Buyer, the client, right? The closing attorney in North Carolina is seen to represent the buyer. So it's going to be the buyer. As a matter of fact, the 2T contract, I'm so glad I can say that now. I have to discipline myself out of saying that throughout the first 2/3 of class because you haven't seen it yet and I don't want to reference it and I don't want to, that's why like people will say, well, what about due diligence? And I'm like, don't talk about that yet. So I'm so glad we're past that point where we can talk about all these things. The 2T contract actually has a paragraph that specifies that settlement or closing will happen at a time and place decided by the buyer. It's actually very clear that it's the buyer's choice. Does closing have to be convenient to the seller? No, because the contract says it's going to be decided by who? By the buyer.
The buyer.
The buyer's choice. Okay. As far as the lender goes, they will also need a copy of that purchase contract because the lender has to begin that process of underwriting the loan. Part of that is going to be ordering an appraisal on the property. They need to know, remember, and I know it's hard to wrap your brain around all this when you haven't been in a transaction yet, but remember 9 times out of 10, when a lender first takes an application from a buyer, from a borrower, the lender has no idea what property is going to be purchased because the buyer is getting pre-approved, pre-qualified. They don't know a property yet. They haven't located a property yet. So the lender needs to be brought up to speed. They've approved this person for the idea of getting a loan, but now the person has moved forward in the process and has actually identified a property and gone under contract on the property. Get the lender a copy of that contract so that they can start to work on the process of ordering an appraisal for that specific property. So they can start to work up what are the closing costs going to be associated with that specific property so that they can issue a new, what's the name of that document they have to issue as soon as they know what updated costs are going to be associated with a loan. They've already given one because they had to give one 3 days, within 3 days after, 3 banking days after the loan was applied for. But now they got to give a new one because they got more specific information. What's that thing called?
Closing disclosure.
The closing disclosure
Oh,
comes at the end.
Loan estimate.
Loan estimate.
Loan
There
estimate.
you go. They'd have to reissue. So think about it. Folks, don't think of a loan estimate as a one and done thing. When a buyer first goes and applies for a loan, they have no idea what property they're going to buy. Does that make sense for everybody? So the
Yeah.
loan estimate, because it has to come within 3 days of application, is basically on a hypothetical made up property. If you bought a house that cost $300,000, here's what we estimate all your costs would be. That's what you're going to get in that first loan estimate. Do you think once you actually go under contract on a property, they're going to have to reissue another loan estimate now that they have more exact ideas of what you're actually buying?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And
For
you'll
sure.
lock your rate and that'll change the term.
Right. Or they maybe interest rates change. Maybe you want to lock in a new rate. Any change that gets made along the way. Remember, the estimate's not meant to be something that can never change. The estimate's simply meant to be the most accurate, currently available statement of what they expect to happen at closing. So if something changes, it just means issue a new estimate. Is everybody good with that? Okay. So the lender needs a copy of the contract. RESPA requires, we talked about RESPA back in Unit 6. RESPA requires that any money that changes hands for any reason that is in any way related to this transaction must be approved by the lender and go on the closing disclosure. Is it okay to buy the buyer a washer and dryer? Is that possible?
Yes.
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 I was hoping you were gonna get them.
as long as
It-
it goes on the closing disclosure and the lender has said, yes, we approve of that. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Just right there, based on the way that question was structured, does everything become easier in a cash transaction?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
For sure, because there's
You
no
gotta
lender to
approve.
ask. It's like going to mom and dad all the time. Can we buy the washer and dryer, please? And see, there are going to be a lot of people that go, it's my money. It's none of the RESPA's damn business. It's none of the lender's business. Well, you may feel that way, but that's not what the federal law says. Does that make sense for everybody? They say if that buyer's going to get something of value, it needs to show up on the closing statement so the lender can know about it. Anything. That's what the law says. That's why the lender needs a copy of the contract so they know exactly what's been promised and what has not been promised. Wrap up all your inspections. Obviously, prior to closing, any inspections, investigations, that could be pest inspections, that could be property inspections, that could be surveys, that could be structural engineers, that could be HVAC people, it could be appraisals. All of that needs to be completed prior to closing. Repairs need to be completed prior to closing. Because remember, folks, we talked about during the contracts chapter, the idea of accord and satisfaction. There's a big fancy phrase. Does anybody remember what accord and satisfaction was? It's when two people are under contract and they get ready to close, but one of them hasn't quite lived up to their end of the bargain, but they do what anyway?
They close anyway.
Close anyway. The law calls that an accord and satisfaction. In other words, you accepted less than you were promised and you closed anyway. After that, is there any more promise, folks?
Nope.
No.
No. The contract's gone. The promises are gone. There is no more you promised. You shouldn't have closed if you wanted the promises to be lived up to. And so all of that needs to be done prior to us being ready to close. We're not ready to close until all these things have been completed, even a final walkthrough. I will say this, and I know it's hard when you put yourself in these real situations. If you aren't willing to stop a closing, then there's really no need for you to do a final walkthrough. I mean, I've said that to agents over the years. Well, we went and did our final walkthrough this morning, and the sellers didn't even move their junk out of the garage. And I said, well, and what are you going to do? Well, we're going to go to the closing and see if we can try to get them to come back and get it. I said, but you're still going to close. Yeah. I said, then why'd you bother with the walkthrough? If you were just going to accept whatever the hell they left you with anyway, what was the point of the walkthrough? Isn't the point of the walkthrough to say, folks, we don't have to go through with this until the seller has lived up to their end of the bargain?
Absolutely.
And so there's no need to conduct a walkthrough if you're not willing to say, wait a minute, I know we're supposed to close today, but we're not going to until you get this resolved.
That's your last chance opportunity
It
to,
is.
correct any mistakes. I remember I was going with Chris Cuddy on one of her final, I think she was going to leave the key or something like that. And I think, long story short, she was the listing agent, and then a buyer agent didn't have, I don't know, it was just a big mess, and they almost had to delay closing for it.
What was the issue?
Basically just that the buyer's agent didn't have a key, and she left the key on the counter, and so it was just a big mess. But it is important for them to be able to go through and verify everything's been done.
Well, yeah, why?
It just came to mind.
The buyer is taking over possession of this property. They're taking over ownership of this property. If you can't do a walkthrough in order to verify that the property is in the condition that it's supposed to be in, don't be shocked when after closing you find something that you're not happy with. That's literally it. That's the whole point of the final walkthrough and doing it. Now, there are two types of closings. In North Carolina, we use the settlement meeting. That's where you hear us refer to a closing attorney. This is definitely not the most common approach in North Carolina. Most common approach nationally, excuse me. It is the most common approach in North Carolina, but not the most common approach nationally. North Carolina is pretty unique in the fact that we use closing attorneys. The closing attorney is usually hired by the buyer to collect all the money from both parties so that they have all the money in one pot, handle the signing, handle the recording of the documents. Here's why it's important to understand the distinction. You might simply see on the test settlement meeting or escrow meeting. Folks, for test taking purposes, they mean what?
The same thing.
Same thing.
The same thing. The settlement meeting or the escrow meeting mean exactly the same thing. It's just what you call it in two different states. If you're in a state that uses title companies, they're going to call it an escrow meeting. You might even hear that. How many of y'all watch like Selling Sunset and all that stuff that on TV, about real estate agents? And you'll hear them say, "We're in escrow." How many of you ever heard them say that? They don't use the phrase that we use. We use the phrase that we're under contract. Why do we use the phrase under contract? Because we're relying on attorneys to finish our transactions, and you have to be an attorney to handle a contract. Does that make sense for everybody? So we go under contract, and then the attorney closes the contract. In states that use title companies, they go into escrow, which is functionally the same thing. Does that make sense for everybody?
Sounds much fancier.
Yeah. What was that, Mandy?
It sounds much fancier.
Doesn't it sound fancier to say we're going into escrow?
Yeah.
It literally just means that the title company who's going to manage the closing has been given all the documents so that they can start the process of closing.
Yeah.
Okay? It's just a different way to handle closings, and that is the more common method in most states. Now, you might see, and I should have put the flag on here, but I got the word North Carolina on here like 16 times. So hopefully that's a hint that this will show up in the state specific section. but I will come back and put the flag on the slide as well. If you are a licensee in North Carolina, the Real Estate Commission has given us a specific job as it relates to this closing statement, this closing process. The North Carolina Real Estate Commission says that real estate brokers in this state, licensees in this state, are required to verify the accuracy of the items on the closing statement, of which they have knowledge. Now, I'm going to say that again. As a North Carolina licensee, I am obligated to verify the accuracy of the closing statement about items of which I have knowledge. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. Now, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to pause the recording for just a second. That's the job. Going through that closing disclosure and looking at the things which we can verify. Here's where you're going to have to be aware on a test, though. This does not include, and this was Howard's question, this does not include all items on a closing statement. As I showed you, like in that one we just took a look at, there were 2 that we could not verify. That's okay. Don't get sucked into the trap on the test of saying, it's almost like the working with real estate agents disclosure. You know, they're always going to have that trap answer of you use it in all transactions, which is not true because you only use it in sales transactions, right?
That's a very dangerous word. And, you know, just to kind of maybe like take people off the edge in regards to this is not something that the Real Estate Commission is going to hold you accountable for if you can't verify it.
Well, right. If you simply say, I have no idea about that number because it was a number beyond my control, what are they going to do? Absolutely nothing. There's no recourse there, and you don't even need to be worried about numbers that are beyond your control. That's what beyond your control means. So don't stress about it. Okay? Fair enough?
Yep.
Okay, good deal. And so examples of things that we clearly can verify, and you just saw them in action on that one that we looked at. We can clearly verify property taxes and make sure that they've been prorated correctly. Notice that was the one where we found the issue that we want to get taken care of on this proposed closing statement. Excise taxes or the revenue stamps, we did the math on that. We figured out that that was correct on that closing statement. The purchase price, any earnest money deposit, any due diligence fee. Now, notice there was no earnest money deposit on there. On that one we just looked at. Let me tell you why there was no earnest money. The transaction had earnest money. Earnest money doesn't impact the seller. I'm verifying this from the seller's side of things. The seller never saw the earnest money, folks. Where is the earnest money?
In a trust.
A trust.
Trust account.
It's sitting in a trust account somewhere. The seller doesn't care about the earnest money because they never got it. Here's effectively what's going to happen on the day of closing. Buyer's going to get a refund of their earnest money and just use it as part of their down payment. So from the seller's perspective, the earnest money never existed if we get to closing. The due diligence fee shows up on the seller's side because that's money they already got. That's money they already put in their pocket, so we have to take it into account. That kind of click in why it was there. It's not that this transaction didn't have any earnest money. It's that it simply doesn't matter to the seller when you get to closing whether there was earnest money or not. It matters to the buyer, but not the seller. Prorated rent. If the property was rented and there was a tenant that was staying in there, we would need to prorate any rent. Any seller paid closing costs. Sometimes sellers will pay closing costs for the buyer. We can verify that because that's from the sales contract. Most of the things that we verify actually come from the sales contract. But then things like title insurance, aggregate adjustment, mortgage insurance, none of those can be verified by us, and therefore we are not held responsible for them. So just to kind of tie a ribbon around that, we are not going to be responsible for verifying the accuracy of the entire document. We are responsible for verifying the accuracy of the parts of the document that we should be able to verify. Does that make sense for everybody? You know, think of it almost like an assembly line on a car. You know, if the door keeps falling off the car, you don't hold everybody who worked on the assembly line responsible. You go find the person who's putting the doors on the car and say, why are you not doing your job? Well, if something didn't get verified on a closing statement and it was something that the real estate brokers didn't have any access to, nobody's going to come to the real estate brokers and go, "You didn't verify this." But I mean, because you would say, "And how would I? Here, why would I?" Everybody okay with that?
Yeah, Travis, if you're working with a buyer, are you responsible for verifying the closing costs from the lender?
Closing costs from the lender? No. You're responsible for verifying that what's on the loan estimate matches what's on the closing disclosure, but verifying that that number itself is right, that's what I would simply say to the buyer is, does this number look familiar to you? Is that the number you understood you were getting as a credit from your lender type thing?
Do you usually go over this with your client before you get to the signing?
Absolutely. Line by line. Here's music to my ears at a closing. When a closing attorney says, "Okay, well, we're going to start to go over the closing statement," and my client who's at the table says, "Oh, well, Travis has already gone over it with us, so we're good." That's such music to my ears. I love it. You know, or when you have a buyer that the attorney starts to go through it with them, and the buyer says, "Oh, yep, no, I understand that. That's my part of the taxes for this year. Travis told me about that." And the rest, and then down here is when I put in my escrow accounts. And sometimes the closing attorneys will just sit back and go, "Well, damn." I mean, it's a good thing isn't it a good thing when your clients are that knowledgeable heading into their own closing? Where they don't, because this is an intimidating process, folks, signing all these documents with all these numbers. They shouldn't be like, they're not going to remember anything from the closing. You know, all that stuff that gets explained to them during the closing, it's in one ear and out the other. So I really do think it's our job to do it ahead of time. I do. Okay.
You have to sign like 870 documents too, so.
At least, exactly. The Good Funds Settlement Act is a federal law that you might see mentioned on the test, but it's a very simple law. You don't get keys until we're closed. We don't release money until we're closed. But now here's the key to those statements. When are we closed? Give me the definition of closing.
When
When recorded at the courthouse.
The deed is recorded. We are not closed at the settlement meeting. Should anybody be leaving the closing attorney's office with keys to a house?
No.
No. Should a seller be leaving a closing attorney's office right after the settlement meeting with a check?
No.
No. Should a real estate firm be leaving a closing attorney's office right after the settlement meeting with a check?
No.
No. No money should be released. No keys should be handed over until those documents have made it to the courthouse and gotten recorded. Is everybody with me on that?
Yes.
That's what the Good Funds Settlement Act says. Says you don't.
That's why the attorney always asks, "Do you want us to mail your check or you want to come back?"
That's exactly what they will ask. They'll say, "Do you want us to mail the check or you want to come back and pick it up? Because you ain't getting it now." And here's what's
I'm like,
frustrating.
"Nah, I'm gonna come back."
Here's what's frustrating about it. You're staring at the check. Like,
Yeah.
and when Seth goes to the closing, he's drooling on the table. He sees the check on the other side of the table. He knows that's his money and he can't have it. Because
And I'm itching.
the reason the check will be there, usually the way most closing attorneys and offices handle this is they'll have the whole closing package ready to go, including all the checks, because they may be writing 15 or 20 checks out of one closing. They may have to pay off the seller's loan. They may have to pay the property taxes. They may have to pay the excise taxes. They may have to pay the recording fees. They may have to pay both real estate firms. They may have to cut a check to a septic repair company. Does that make sense for everybody? They got to cut a check to the homeowner's insurance company. There might be 20 checks that have to be cut out of this transaction. And that paralegal, bless their hearts, will have done all of that before anybody ever sits down at that settlement meeting. And they'll have all the checks ready and in envelopes ready to be sent out, usually with a big old clip attached to the file. Just because they're there doesn't mean they can be released, because the documents have not yet been what?
Recorded.
Recorded.
I
A lot
have
of
a
times it's pretty
question,
quick.
Travis.
Yes, ma'am. I'm
The
sorry.
good fund, doesn't the good fund settlement also dictate how funds can be delivered to the transaction? Like you can't write a personal check, that kind of
Yes,
thing?
it does. But they don't test you on that, but it does.
Okay.
Yes, the Good Fund Settlement Act talks about, like what are acceptable transfers, like wire transfers, and how the money has to be documented. Don't bring, a couple $100,000 in cash in a suitcase to the closing, because that's probably not gonna fly. That kind of thing. But the part you would be asked about is the you don't get keys until you're closed. All right. Like we say, as far as the insurance, which we mentioned again earlier this morning, it bears mentioning again here. Until the deed is recorded, the seller should treat the property as if it is still theirs. They should not start to treat it as if they've already sold it simply because they left the settlement meeting. It's still their property until the deed's recorded. Until they've heard from the closing attorney, yes, we're recorded, don't cancel anything. Don't turn off utilities. Don't cancel insurance. Don't do anything you wouldn't do for any property that you own until you don't own it anymore. So continue to pay for those things until the documents are recorded.
How long does that normally take?
How long does recording normally take? Was that the question?
2 hours.
Yes, yes.
So normally with recording, it depends on what time of day you went to the closing attorney's office for the settlement. It also depends on where they're located in relation to the courthouse. And the third factor, which is a major factor, is does that county allow e-recording or electronic recording? Like, for example, Wake County allows electronic recording. Most closing attorneys who close transactions for Wake County, even if the attorney's not located in Wake County. So as an example, a good friend of mine owns a law firm in Chapel Hill, does a lot of Raleigh closings, but Wake County allows electronic recording. They can record directly from their office. They don't ever have to physically go to the courthouse. There's a system that they've set up to allow that closing attorney to have basically backdoor access into the Register of Deeds systems, where they can record directly from their office. So when you do a Wake County closing with them, even though they're all the way in Chapel Hill, they can be recorded 20 or 30 minutes after you sit down and sign everything. But if you're dealing with a more traditional closing attorney that might only make one trip a day to the courthouse, and you go and you have your settlement meeting at 10 o'clock in the morning, but they have a runner that makes a trip to the courthouse to record documents at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you might not get recorded until 4:30. So it just depends on if they're physically doing it and how far they got to go. But it should be same day. That's the goal, for it to be the same day. That's why I also don't ever schedule Friday closings. Those are a no-no for me. Because what if somebody gets caught in traffic and we don't get recorded? Well, then that means you can't give these people keys until Monday, and they're not going to be happy about that. I try to avoid that situation. How we all feel? Pretty good about that?
Mhm.